miles from the nearest neighbor. No cell signal, no police response, no one to hear you scream. Tonight, I'm bringing you 4 terrifying stories from individuals who escaped civilization, only to discover that the further you run from society, the closer you get to something far worse than anything in the city. Before we go into the darkness, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it shows on your clock right now. I want to know who's experiencing these nightmares with me tonight. Do me a favor right now. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and ring that notification bell so you never miss when we upload new terrors. We release content regularly, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's begin. The padlock on my barn had been replaced with an identical one, and the key I'd carried for 3 years no longer worked. My name is Callister, and during March of 2019, I experienced something at my off-grid property in northwestern Montana that fundamentally rewired how I understand vulnerability. I'm sharing this because people romanticize remote living without comprehending the genuine dangers of existing beyond society's protective infrastructure. I had purchased 40 acres of forested land near the Canadian border in 2016. The property included a small cabin, a deteriorating barn, and absolute solitude. The nearest occupied residence sat 11 miles away. The closest town with any services was a 40-minute drive on unpaved roads that became impassable during winter storms. This isolation was precisely what I wanted. I had spent 15 years working in corporate finance in Chicago. The constant connectivity, the endless demands, the suffocating presence of millions of people pressing against my existence from every direction. I burned out completely at 38 and decided to pursue a different path. For 3 years, I lived contentedly on that land. I installed solar panels for electricity. I dug a well for water. I heated with wood I cut myself. I grew vegetables in the summer and canned them for winter. I hunted deer and elk to fill my freezer. I became entirely self-sufficient, dependent on the outside world only for occasional supply runs every 6 to 8 weeks. The barn served primarily as storage. I kept firewood stacked inside during autumn. I stored my ATV there, old furniture that came with the property, tools I rarely needed. The structure was solid despite its age, with a hayloft that still held decades-old bales from previous owners. I secured the barn with a heavy-duty padlock whenever I left for supply runs. Not because I feared theft, who would travel 11 miles through wilderness to steal old tools, but because I worried about animals getting inside. Bears had broken into outbuildings throughout the region, causing tremendous damage. In late February 2019, I drove into town for my winter supply run. The trip took 3 days. 1 day driving down, 1 day gathering supplies and handling business, 1 day driving back. This was my routine. It never varied. When I returned on March 4th, everything appeared normal. My cabin was undisturbed. The solar panels had kept the batteries charged. Snow had accumulated on the roof, but nothing concerning. I unloaded my supplies, started a fire in the wood stove, and settled in for the evening. The following morning, I walked to the barn to retrieve my chainsaw. I needed to cut more firewood before the next cold front arrived. My key didn't work. I stood at the barn door, inserting the key into the padlock, turning it left and right, confused by the resistance. The key had worked perfectly for 3 years. Locks don't simply stop functioning without cause. I examined the padlock more closely. Same brand, same model, same weathered gray appearance. But the keyhole orientation was slightly different, and there were fresh scratches around the shackle where someone had cut through the original lock. Someone had removed my padlock and replaced it with their own. The realization hit me with physical force. I staggered backward, staring at that door, processing the implications. Someone had been here while I was gone. Someone with tools. Someone with purpose. Someone who wanted access to my barn and didn't want me to have it. I looked around the property with new eyes. The snow showed only my own tracks from that morning, but there had been snowfall during my absence. Any prior tracks would be covered. I searched the perimeter for any other signs of disturbance, but found nothing obvious. My mind raced through explanations. Maybe a Forest Service ranger? Perhaps someone from the county needed access for some official purpose. But no authority would cut a private lock and replace it without leaving notification. That made no sense. I retrieved bolt cutters from my cabin and approached the barn. My hands trembled as I positioned the blades around the unfamiliar padlock's shackle. I was suddenly terrified of what I might find inside. The cutters bit through the metal with a decisive snap. The padlock fell into the snow. I pulled open the barn door and stepped into the dim interior. What I found wasn't what I expected. It was worse. Someone had been living in my barn, not camping temporarily. Living. For what appeared to be an extended duration. The hayloft had been converted into a sleeping area. Old blankets and sleeping bags formed a nest in one corner. Empty food cans littered the floor, water bottles, candy wrappers, cigarette butts ground into the wooden planks. A bucket that had clearly been used as a toilet sat in the opposite corner, the smell reaching me even in the cold air. I climbed the ladder to the loft with growing dread. The nest of bedding was still arranged, still pressed down from body weight. Whoever had slept here had left recently. Very recently. Among the debris, I found evidence that chilled me more than the winter air. Photographs, Polaroids, images of my cabin taken from various angles. My truck, my garden beds in summer. The path I walked each morning to check my solar panels, my propane tank, my well pump, and photographs of me. Through my cabin windows, splitting wood outside, carrying water, eating dinner at my kitchen table, sleeping in my bed. Someone had been observing me for months, documenting my routines, learning my patterns, all while living less than 100 feet from where I slept each night. I descended from the loft on unsteady legs. My eyes swept across the main barn floor, now seeing details I had initially missed. Scratches on the wooden walls at eye level, viewing angles that provided sight lines toward my cabin, a gap between boards that had been widened deliberately, allowing observation without exposure. This person had been watching me, studying me. For how long? Since summer, based on the garden photographs. That meant they had spent autumn and winter in this barn, observing my life while I remained completely oblivious. I ran back to my cabin and locked myself inside. I retrieved my rifle from the gun cabinet and chambered around. I closed all the curtains. I checked every window, every door, every possible entry point. My mind kept circling the most terrifying question. Where were they now? They had changed the lock to keep me out of the barn. That suggested they intended to return. They had left their bedding, their supplies, their photographs. They hadn't abandoned the location. They had simply stepped away temporarily. Were they watching me right now? From the tree line? From another vantage point I hadn't discovered? I spent the remainder of that day fortifying my cabin. I moved furniture against doors. I loaded additional weapons. I positioned myself where I could observe the barn through a gap in the curtains. As darkness fell, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't sleep knowing someone might be approaching through the darkness. Someone who knew my routines, my vulnerabilities, my patterns. Someone who had spent months preparing for something I couldn't predict. I packed essential supplies into my truck. I kept my rifle across my lap. I started the engine and drove away from my property at 11 p.m., navigating the unpaved road by headlights that seemed far too weak against the pressing darkness. The drive to town took nearly 2 hours in winter conditions. I arrived after midnight and went directly to the county sheriff's office. I filed a report that the exhausted deputy on duty clearly considered unusual. Squatters on remote property weren't unheard of, but the surveillance photographs elevated this beyond typical trespassing. 2 deputies accompanied me back to my property the following morning. We arrived in full daylight, weapons drawn, unsure what we would encounter. The barn was empty, not just of the occupant, of everything. The nest of bedding had been removed. The food containers were gone. The bucket had disappeared. The photographs of me had vanished. Even the cigarette butts had been collected and taken away. Someone had returned during the night and cleaned the entire scene, erased every trace of their presence. The only evidence remaining was the cut padlock lying in the snow where I had dropped it. The deputies photographed the empty loft. They documented what I had described. But without physical evidence, they could offer limited assistance. They promised increased patrols in the area, but I knew what that meant. Maybe 1 drive-by per week. Maybe. My property was simply too remote for regular monitoring. I didn't return to living there full-time. I couldn't. The violation was too complete. Someone had infiltrated my sanctuary, observed my most private moments, and documented everything with an intensity that suggested planning for something specific. Over the following weeks, I installed trail cameras throughout my property. I positioned them to capture anyone approaching from any direction. I set them to transmit images to a satellite receiver, allowing me to monitor the land remotely. For 2 months, the cameras captured nothing but wildlife. Deer, elk, the occasional bear emerging from hibernation. I began to hope that my discovery had scared the intruder away permanently. Then, on May 17th, the cameras captured a figure, a man, walking through my property in broad daylight. He approached the barn, circled it twice, and then stood facing the camera that watched the structure. He stood there for approximately 3 minutes, staring directly into the lens. Then he raised his hand and waved. He knew the cameras were there. He had found them. And he wanted me to know that he knew. The image was grainy, captured from a distance, but certain details were visible. White male, heavy build, dark clothing, a beard that obscured most of his face. Nothing distinctive enough for identification. I never saw him on camera again. The barn remained empty. My property showed no further signs of disturbance, but I understood the message he had sent with that wave. He could return anytime he wanted. He knew my security measures. He had already proven he could evade detection for months. I sold the property in August of 2019. I took a significant loss on the sale, but I no longer cared about financial considerations. I couldn't own land that someone else clearly considered theirs. The new owners reported no issues during their first year. Perhaps the intruder had moved on to other targets. Perhaps he simply hadn't developed the same interest in them that he had cultivated toward me. I returned to urban living. I rented an apartment in a building with security cameras, locked entrances, and neighbors on every side. The isolation I once craved now terrified me. The silence I once treasured now seemed threatening. 73 miles of empty desert separated my property from the nearest paved road, and someone was intercepting my supply deliveries before I could reach them. I go by Thames, and what I'm describing happened during October of 2017 at my off-grid homestead in southern Arizona. I'm a retired wildlife biologist who spent my career studying desert ecosystems. When I left that profession, I decided to immerse myself permanently in the landscape I had devoted my life to understanding. I never anticipated that the solitude I sought would transform into a prison. My property consisted of 20 acres of Sonoran desert at the base of a small mountain range. The land had been used for mining in the early 1900s, and the original prospector's cabin still stood, which I renovated into a comfortable dwelling. Solar power, rainwater collection supplemented by monthly water deliveries, propane for cooking, a radio for emergency communication since cell service didn't exist within 40 miles. I had established an arrangement with a supply company in Tucson. Every 4 weeks, a driver would deliver water, propane, dry goods, and mail to a designated drop point, where the unpaved road became impassable for their delivery truck. I would then retrieve these supplies using my capable four-wheel drive vehicle. The system had functioned perfectly for 2 years, until September of 2017, when my supplies began disappearing. The first incident seemed like a simple miscommunication. I drove to the drop point expecting to find my usual delivery. The water barrels should have been there, the propane tanks, the boxes of provisions I had ordered. The location was empty. I radioed the supply company using my vehicle's emergency system. They confirmed delivery had been completed 2 days prior. The driver had photographed the supplies at the drop point as standard procedure. He showed them exactly where I expected them to be. Someone had taken everything. 73 miles of empty desert. No other properties within a 50-mile radius. Who would even know about my supply drops? Who would traverse that distance to steal water and canned goods? I drove back to my homestead, rationing what provisions I had remaining. The supply company agreed to resend the delivery the following week, waiving the additional fee given the unusual circumstances. I assumed the theft was a one-time occurrence. Perhaps someone lost in the desert had stumbled upon my supplies and taken them out of desperation. Strange, but explainable. The replacement delivery disappeared as well. This time, I had driven to the drop point the same day the delivery was scheduled. I arrived approximately 3 hours after the supply company confirmed the driver had departed their facility. The journey from Tucson took roughly 5 hours in good conditions. When I reached the location, fresh tire tracks marked where the delivery truck had stopped. Drag marks showed where heavy containers had been unloaded. And additional tire tracks, different tread pattern, different wheelbase, showed where another vehicle had approached from a separate direction. Someone was monitoring the deliveries, timing their arrivals to intercept my supplies before I could retrieve them. This wasn't opportunistic theft. This was surveillance, planning, targeted action. I followed the unfamiliar tire tracks away from the drop point. They led northwest, toward the mountain range, along a route that wasn't marked on any map I possessed. The trail eventually disappeared, where rocky terrain replaced sand, making tracking impossible. Whoever was taking my supplies knew this landscape. They knew which paths to use. They knew how to vanish. I returned to my homestead with nothing except the growing certainty that I was being specifically targeted. My water reserves were becoming dangerously low. My food stores would last perhaps another week. I was 73 miles from help with someone actively working to cut off my lifeline. The supply company refused to continue deliveries after the second theft. The cost of goods being repeatedly stolen exceeded what my account could sustain. They suggested I arrange for personal pickup in Tucson instead. Driving nearly 150 miles round trip every month wasn't sustainable. The fuel consumption alone would strain my limited resources. More importantly, leaving my property for an entire day meant abandoning my home to whoever was operating in this region. I decided to change tactics. I arranged for the next delivery to occur at an alternate location, a secondary drop point I had established for emergencies, 12 miles further from my property, but more visible from an elevated position. I would camp nearby and observe the delivery, waiting to see who approached. On October 3, 2017, I positioned myself on a rocky overlook approximately half a mile from the alternate drop point. I carried binoculars, my rifle, water, and enough provisions for 24 hours. The delivery was scheduled for late morning. The truck arrived at 11:47 a.m. I watched the driver unload my supplies, water barrels, propane tanks, boxes of dry goods. He photographed the delivery, returned to his vehicle, and departed the way he had come. I noted the time. 12:03 p.m. I settled in to wait. At 2:34 p.m., a vehicle appeared on the horizon. Not approaching from the direction of my property or from Tucson, emerging from the northwest, from the mountain range, from wherever those mysterious tire tracks had led. Through my binoculars, I observed an old pickup truck, sun-bleached white, with what appeared to be homemade modifications to the suspension and tires. Desert adapted, capable of traversing terrain that would strand conventional vehicles. The truck approached the drop point slowly, cautiously. The driver appeared to scan the surroundings before exiting the vehicle. A man, thin and weathered, with skin darkened by decades of sun exposure. Long gray hair pulled back from a face that seemed carved from the desert itself. He wore clothing that had no identifiable brand or style, garments that appeared handmade from rough fabric. He approached my supplies and began loading them into his truck. I had my rifle. I could have confronted him, but something about this situation warned me against direct engagement. This man knew the desert. He knew my delivery schedule. He had operated here long enough to establish routes and methods that allowed him to remain completely undetected. What else did he know? Where did he live? How many others might be with him? I watched him finish loading my supplies. He worked efficiently, with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times before. When the last barrel was secured, he paused. He turned and looked directly at my position. I was half a mile away, concealed among rocks, using no equipment that would reflect the light or create a visible signature. There was no logical way he could have detected my presence. But he looked right at me, a gesture that seemed like an acknowledgement, recognition, as if he had known I was watching the entire time. Then he climbed into his truck and drove northwest, disappearing toward the mountains. I remained frozen on that overlook for another hour, afraid to descend, afraid he might be waiting. When I finally gathered the courage to return to my vehicle and drive to the drop point, I found the location empty, except for my supplies' absence and his tire tracks. I radioed the county sheriff from my vehicle. I described what I had witnessed. The dispatcher took my information, but offered little encouragement. Without a license plate number or precise location, they had limited ability to investigate. The area I described fell within a desert wilderness that rarely saw official presence. I drove back to my homestead with trembling hands. My supply situation had become critical. I had perhaps 4 days of water remaining. I needed to make a choice: stay and risk running completely dry, or leave and potentially never return. I chose to leave. I packed essential belongings into my vehicle. I secured my homestead as well as possible. I drove the 73 miles to the paved road and continued to Tucson, where I checked into a motel and tried to process what was happening. Over the following weeks, I researched the region more thoroughly than I ever had before. I spoke with longtime residents of the surrounding areas. I contacted county officials and historians. I searched for any information about individuals living in that remote section of the desert. What I discovered was deeply unsettling. Rumors had circulated for decades about a community living in the mountain range. Not a community in any official sense. No registered property, no postal addresses, no tax records. A collection of individuals who had rejected society entirely, who had built something in that wilderness beyond the reach of any authority. The details were vague and contradictory. Some claimed the group numbered in dozens. Others said only a handful remained from a larger population that had dwindled over generations. Some described them as harmless hermits. Others whispered about violence toward anyone who ventured too close. The consistent element across all accounts was territoriality. They considered the surrounding desert their domain. Anyone who established residence within their perceived boundaries was subject to their particular form of regulation. I had built my homestead within their territory. My supplies weren't being stolen, they were being collected, taxed, claimed by individuals who believed that land belonged to them, regardless of what any legal document stated. I never returned to live on that property. I hired a service to retrieve my remaining belongings. The cabin I rented for 6 months had an occupant the owner failed to mention, and he lived close enough to hear my conversations through thin walls. I am called Ehrlis, and these events unfolded during July of 2018 in remote interior Alaska. I was a doctoral candidate in environmental science, conducting field research on boreal forest ecosystems for my dissertation. The research required extended stays in wilderness areas, and I had arranged to rent a cabin from a landowner who promised isolation, basic amenities, and access to pristine study sites. What I actually received was a lesson in the dangers of trusting strangers with your safety. The cabin sat approximately 40 miles from the nearest road, accessible by conventional vehicle. Access required either a bush plane landing on a small lake 2 miles away, or an arduous overland trek through trackless forest. I chose the bush plane option, hiring a pilot who would deliver me in June and retrieve me in November, with one mid-season supply drop in August. The arrangement seemed ideal. Complete immersion in my research environment. No distractions, no interruptions. Just myself, my equipment, and the forest I had dedicated years to understanding. The landowner, a man named Pemberton, who operated a small guiding business in Fairbanks, had described the property in detail. A single cabin with a wood stove, basic furnishings, and rainwater collection. Solar charging for small electronics, an outhouse, a food cache elevated on poles to protect from bears. Everything I needed for extended field work. What Pemberton had not mentioned was his brother. I discovered Corvin's existence on my 3rd night at the property. I had been organizing my research equipment, preparing for the following day's first data collection, when I heard a sound that shouldn't have existed. A voice. Not an animal. Not wind through branches. A human voice, speaking conversationally, somewhere in the forest surrounding the cabin. I froze. The pilot had confirmed no other parties were scheduled in this area. The nearest known habitation was a hunting camp 60 miles south, and it was unoccupied during the summer months. I should have been the only person within a day's journey. The voice continued. A man speaking in a low register, occasionally laughing, occasionally pausing, as if in dialogue with someone I couldn't hear. I extinguished my lamp. I moved to the window and peered into the golden twilight that passed for night during Alaska's summer months. The spruce forest pressed close around the cabin, visibility limited to perhaps 50 meters before the trees became impenetrable. I couldn't see anyone, but the voice persisted, sometimes closer, sometimes further. Never loud enough for me to distinguish words, but always present. After perhaps an hour, the voice faded entirely. I remained awake until exhaustion overcame vigilance, sleeping poorly with my research knife clutched in one hand. Morning brought no explanations. I circled the cabin searching for tracks or other evidence of human presence. The soft forest floor showed nothing conclusive. I convinced myself I had imagined the voice, a product of isolation and unfamiliar surroundings. That explanation sustained me for 3 days. Then I found the structure. I had been conducting transect surveys approximately 1 mile north of the cabin when I emerged into a small clearing that shouldn't have existed. In the center of this clearing stood a rough shelter built from spruce poles, tarps, and salvaged materials. A fire ring with fresh ash, drying racks for fish, a small garden plot with vegetables growing in neat rows. Someone lived here, less than a mile from the cabin I had rented, close enough to reach in minutes, close enough to observe every aspect of my presence on this land. I retreated from the clearing as quietly as possible, my heart pounding, my mind racing. Pemberton had said nothing about another occupant. He had assured me of complete isolation. He had accepted my money under false pretenses. When I returned to my cabin, I found evidence that the situation was worse than I had imagined. My food cache had been accessed. Not by bears. The protective measures were intact. By human hands that had climbed the support poles, opened the containers, and examined the contents. Several items were missing. Canned fish, dried fruit, coffee, and one of my notebooks had been removed, examined, and returned, but placed at a different angle than I had left it. Someone had been in my camp while I was away. Someone who had handled my belongings, read my research notes, helped himself to my supplies, and done so with complete confidence that I would never detect his presence. Except I had found his shelter. I knew he existed now. I spent the following days in a state of heightened awareness that made productive research impossible. I documented everything. The sounds at night, which resumed on the 5th evening, closer this time, sometimes seeming to circle the cabin entirely. The small signs of disturbance at my food cache. The feeling of being observed that never lifted regardless of where I worked or what I did. On the 8th day, Corvin introduced himself. I was collecting water from the creek when he appeared. He simply emerged from the tree line, perhaps 30 feet away, as if he had been standing there all along waiting for me to notice him. Middle-aged, tall but gaunt, suggesting years of marginal nutrition. Clothing that had been repaired countless times until it resembled patchwork more than any recognizable garment. Eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. "You're Pemberton's renter," he said. Not a question, a statement of fact from someone who had been observing me long enough to draw conclusions. I stood frozen, my water container half filled, uncertain whether to run or attempt conversation. "I'm Corvin," he continued, "Pemberton's brother. He didn't tell you about me. He never does." The words emerged before I could consider their wisdom. "You've been in my cabin. You've taken my food." Corvin nodded without embarrassment. "You brought too much. You wouldn't have noticed." "I did notice," he shrugged. "Then you're more observant than most of Pemberton's renters. Most never know I exist. Most leave thinking they were completely alone the entire time." The implication chilled me more than his physical presence. How many people had stayed in this cabin over the years? How many had slept peacefully believing themselves isolated, while Corvin circled their dwelling, accessed their belongings, read their private documents? "What do you want?" I asked. "Nothing you aren't willing to give. Company, occasionally. Conversation. The researchers who come here are usually interesting. They know things about the forest that I don't. I learn from them, by spying on them." Corvin's expression flickered, annoyance or amusement, I couldn't determine which. "By observing. The forest requires observation. Everything in it observes everything else. I'm simply part of that system." I demanded that he leave me alone. I threatened to contact authorities through my emergency beacon. I made clear that his behavior was unacceptable, that his brother would face consequences for failing to disclose his presence. Corvin listened to my protests with apparent patience. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "I'll keep my distance," he said. "But you should understand something. This forest isn't yours because you paid my brother for that cabin. This forest isn't anyone's. I've lived here for 19 years. I've buried friends in this soil. I've survived winters that killed men stronger than me." He paused, those unsettling eyes finally focusing on mine directly. "You're a guest here, not just in the cabin, in the forest itself. Guests should be polite. Guests should remember that hospitality can be withdrawn." He turned and walked back into the trees. Within seconds, the forest had swallowed him entirely, as if he had never existed. I activated my emergency beacon that night. I transmitted a message requesting early extraction. I explained the situation in terms the bush pilot would understand. An undisclosed occupant, personal safety concerns, research protocols compromised. The pilot arrived 3 days later. 3 days during which I barely slept, during which I heard Corvin's voice circling my cabin every night, sometimes speaking in languages I didn't recognize. Sometimes laughing at jokes meant only for himself. On the second night, I woke to find my cabin door open. I had secured it before sleeping. The latch had been lifted from outside. The door stood ajar, forest air flooding into the space I had believed was mine. Nothing was taken. Nothing was disturbed. The message was clear. Locks meant nothing to someone who had spent 19 years mastering this environment. When the pilot landed on the lake, I was waiting with my essential equipment packed. I left most of my supplies behind, payment of some kind, though for what I couldn't articulate. I flew out of that wilderness without looking back. Pemberton refunded half my rental fee after I threatened legal action. He claimed ignorance about his brother's behavior, said Corvin was harmless and just lonely. He had been renting that cabin to researchers for over a decade, and no one else had ever complained, because no one else had ever discovered Corvin existed. 47 photographs over 16 nights, and in every single image, the same man stood on my property staring directly into the camera lens. My designation among those who know this story is Oleander, and the incidents I'm relating took place during November of 2020 in the Coast Range of Western Oregon. I had inherited property from an uncle who had lived entirely off-grid for the final 22 years of his existence. When he passed, I decided to assume his lifestyle, a choice that initially seemed like freedom and ultimately revealed itself as exposure. My uncle's property encompassed 80 acres of dense forest land, accessible only by a deteriorating logging road that became impassable during the rainy season. The cabin he had constructed was remarkably well designed. Passive solar heating, gravity-fed water from a spring uphill, composting systems, and root cellars stocked with preserved food that could sustain one person for months. I moved onto the property in August, giving myself several months to learn its systems before the isolating rains of autumn made the access road treacherous. By October, I had established routines and rhythms that felt sustainable. I was producing my own food, managing my own energy needs, and experiencing a satisfaction that my previous urban existence had never provided. In early November, I installed trail cameras around the property perimeter. This wasn't motivated by security concerns. I wanted to document the wildlife that moved through these forests: deer, elk, the occasional black bear, perhaps even a mountain lion if I was fortunate. My uncle had been a naturalist at heart, and I intended to continue his informal study of the local ecosystem. I positioned 8 cameras at strategic points: game trails, water sources, and natural travel corridors between habitat zones. Each camera was motion activated with infrared capability for nighttime capture. each stored images on a memory card I would collect and review weekly. The first week's harvest was encouraging. Deer frequenting the spring. Raccoons are investigating the compost area. Coyotes passing through on what appeared to be regular patrol routes. The wildlife my uncle had described in his journals was exactly where he said it would be. The second week's harvest changed everything. I was reviewing images at my cabin table, scrolling through dozens of wildlife photographs when a different kind of image appeared. A man, standing on the game trail approximately 200 meters from my cabin, facing the camera directly, caught in the infrared flash like a ghost emerging from darkness. I didn't recognize him. He didn't resemble anyone I had encountered during my months on the property, but he clearly knew the camera was there. His stance was deliberate. His gaze was fixed on the lens. He had positioned himself precisely within the frame. I continued scrolling. The next image was captured 3 hours later. The same man, different camera location. Same direct confrontation with the lens, and again, and again. Across multiple cameras, across multiple nights. The same figure appearing at different points around my property perimeter, always facing the camera, always seemingly aware of exactly where the lens was pointed. 47 images, 16 nights. A systematic documentation of every camera I had installed. The man appeared to be in his late 30s or early 40s. Average build. Dark clothing that blended with the forest. His face was expressionless in every image. Not threatening, not friendly, simply observing, recording, establishing his presence in my surveillance system as if claiming equal right to watch. I called the county sheriff using my emergency radio. The deputy who responded seemed skeptical, but agreed to visit the property once the access road dried sufficiently for his vehicle. That would be at least a week, he estimated. In the meantime, he suggested I document any further activity and avoid confrontation. The following night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my cabin with the lights extinguished, watching the perimeter through windows, my uncle's hunting rifle within reach. The forest remained silent. Nothing moved except the wind through Douglas fir branches. In the morning, I checked the cameras. The memory cards contained 12 new images. All featured the same man. All showed him in different locations. Several images captured him significantly closer to the cabin than previous photographs, within 100 meters, within 75, within 50. He was approaching incrementally, establishing precedent, demonstrating that each night brought him closer to my dwelling, and there was nothing I could do to prevent it. I increased my defensive measures. I positioned additional cameras, including one aimed directly at my cabin entrance. I established trip lines with tin cans at key approach points, primitive alarms that would alert me to anyone passing. I kept the rifle loaded and within arm's reach at all times. For 3 nights, the cameras captured nothing. No wildlife, no intruder. Nothing except empty forest and falling rain. I began to wonder if my visible preparations had discouraged further incursions. On the 4th night, my perimeter alarm sounded. The clanking of tin cans jerked me from shallow sleep. I grabbed the rifle and moved to the window, pressing myself against the wall to minimize my visibility. The sound stopped. The forest returned to silence. I remained motionless for an hour, watching the darkness, seeing nothing. Eventually, exhaustion overwhelmed vigilance, and I returned to restless sleep. Morning revealed what I had missed. The trip lines had been triggered, then carefully reset. Someone had approached the cabin, deliberately activated my alarms, and then restored the system to its previous state before withdrawing. And a new image waited on the camera, aimed at my cabin entrance. The man, standing at my front door, his face perhaps 2 feet from the lens, his expression unchanged from every previous photograph. and in his hand, held up for the camera to record, was a key. My uncle's spare key. The key I had never found when I inventoried his belongings. The key that had presumably been hidden somewhere on the property, known only to my uncle and whoever else had visited during his 22 years of isolation. This man had access to my cabin. He had always had access, and he was making certain I understood that fact. I abandoned the property that morning. I packed essential documents, irreplaceable items, and as many supplies as I could carry. I hiked the logging road despite the mud, reaching the paved county road after 7 hours of exhausting effort. The sheriff's deputy met me at the trailhead. I showed him the camera images. I showed him the photograph of the man holding the key. I described the systematic escalation, the deliberate approaches, the message being communicated through this campaign of surveillance. The deputy's response was not what I expected. "That sounds like Mercer," he said, studying the photographs. "Lives somewhere back in those hills. Been there longer than anyone can remember. Probably knew your uncle." Knew my uncle? My uncle never mentioned anyone. The deputy shrugged. "Mercer doesn't interact much. Shows up in town maybe twice a year for supplies he can't produce himself. Otherwise, keeps completely to himself. Harmless, as far as we know." Harmless? He's been circling my cabin. He has a key to my door. If he wanted to hurt you, he would have done it already. Man's had 20 years to learn those woods. If he wanted you gone, you'd be gone. The deputy's logic was horrifying in its practicality. Mercer hadn't attacked me. He had simply made clear that he could, that my locks meant nothing, that my preparations were insufficient, that my presence on this property was tolerated rather than welcomed. I returned once with the deputy as escort to retrieve the remaining essential items. The cabin showed no signs of entry. Nothing was disturbed or missing, but the camera aimed at the entrance contained one final image. Mercer, standing in the same position, no longer holding the key, instead holding a handwritten sign. The sign contained a single word: "Welcome." I interpreted this as mockery. The deputy suggested it might be genuine, an awkward attempt at neighborly greeting from a man who had forgotten how normal people communicate. I didn't care about his interpretation. I arranged for a property management company to handle the sale of my uncle's land. I returned to Portland and rented an apartment in a building with security doors, neighbors on all sides, and the constant background hum of civilization. The property was eventually sold to a timber company that planned to harvest the old growth and replant with commercial species. I received the payment and tried not to think about what might have become of Mercer, whether he had moved to a different territory or simply absorbed the logging crews into his system of surveillance. My uncle lived on that property for 22 years. He died there, alone, found weeks later by a mail carrier who noticed accumulating packages. I had always assumed he treasured his solitude. Now I wonder if his solitude was ever real. I wonder if Mercer watched him for 2 decades, the way he watched me. I wonder if my uncle knew about those watching eyes in the darkness and simply accepted them as the cost of living beyond society's protection. Some questions shouldn't be answered. Some properties shouldn't be inherited. And some forests contain presences that exist beyond any map or deed or legal framework. They were there before we arrived. They'll remain after we leave. And in between, we exist at their sufferance, never quite as alone as we believe ourselves to be. Those were 4 genuine accounts from individuals who sought escape in remote places and discovered that isolation provides no protection, only exposure. If you're considering off-grid living, understand this. Distance from civilization doesn't mean distance from danger. It means distance from help. Every mile between you and the nearest neighbor is a mile between you and rescue if something goes wrong. Research your property thoroughly. Know your neighbors, even if they're miles away. Establish communication protocols. Tell someone your schedule, and never assume that being alone means being safe. Drop a comment now telling me where you're watching from and what time it shows on your clock. I want to know who experienced these nightmares with me tonight. Hit subscribe, tap the like, ring that notification bell. Until next time, stay aware, stay connected, stay alive.